He thought God had abandoned him. A broken war veteran living alone in the snow, until one freezing night, his son's German shepherd began to dig beneath the ice. What the dog uncovered would defy logic, faith, and death itself. Buried deep beneath the frozen ground was a letter, written by his son, 5 years after he died in Afghanistan. Every new discovery led the old man closer to something greater than grief, a divine sign hidden in the storm. Because sometimes, miracles don't fall from the sky. They rise from the cold earth, carried by love that refuses to die. A dog's loyalty became the bridge between heaven and a father's broken heart. What happens next will restore your faith in love, loss, and God's mysterious ways. Before we begin, please subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us in spreading stories that remind the world. Miracles still happen. The wind crawled across Portland, Maine, carrying with it the taste of iron and salt from the frozen bay. Snow whispered against the window panes of a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of the city, where an old man sat alone beside a half-burned fire. His name was Thomas Reed, a retired Marine Corps sergeant in his early 70s, broad-shouldered still, though age had carved deep trenches across his face. His once black hair had turned to the color of steel, cropped short out of habit, and a neatly trimmed gray beard shadowed the hard line of his jaw. His eyes were a weary blue, clear but dulled by things he no longer spoke about. He carried himself the way soldiers do when they no longer expect to be saluted. Thomas's home was spare, a fortress built for one. The walls bore photographs yellowed by time, his unit in Vietnam, his wedding day, and in the center, a picture of a young man in desert fatigues, smiling beside a German shepherd. That was Michael Reed, Thomas's son, his only child, who had followed his father's footsteps into the Marines and never returned from Afghanistan. Thomas had received the folded flag himself, standing on his porch in the rain 5 winters ago. He had not cried then. He had simply said thank you to the 2 officers and closed the door. The tears came later, when no one could see. Across the room, lying near the hearth, was Scout, the German shepherd from the photograph. 10 years old now, large and broad-chested, his coat was a mix of black and fawn, his muzzle flecked with gray. His eyes, deep amber, intelligent, tracked every movement Thomas made. The dog had served beside Michael overseas as a bomb detection K9, trained to detect the invisible and endure the unimaginable. When Michael died, the Marines sent Scout home with a medal and a letter that said he was loyal to the end. Thomas hadn't known what to do with that. He didn't need the medal. He needed his son. Scout had filled that silence the way only a dog can. He understood the house's rhythm. When Thomas rose before dawn, when he brewed his black coffee, when he went quiet staring at the flag folded in glass. The dog would rest his chin on the man's boot, as if to remind him that breath still existed in the room. Yet Thomas rarely spoke. Words felt too fragile to use. His voice, once the voice of command, had grown hoarse from disuse, like an instrument left in the cold. Outside, the snow thickened. The old man stirred the fire and watched the sparks climb the chimney. He thought of the day Michael enlisted, how proud he had been, and how afraid. Thomas had never said no. He had worn the same uniform once, and he understood the call that drove a man to serve. But he also knew the cost. In the war of his youth, Thomas had lost his best friend in a rice paddy near Da Nang. He still remembered the sound, the sharp, metallic whine of a bullet cutting air, and the look in his friend's eyes as he went still. Since then, Thomas had built walls inside himself, each loss a brick. Michael's death had sealed the last gap. A soft sound pulled him from the memory, the steady rhythm of paws against the floor. Scout had risen and was pacing toward the window, ears alert. The dog's breath fogged the glass as he looked outside into the white dark. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from long silence. Scout gave a short, low bark and scratched once at the door. Thomas frowned. "It's past midnight." The dog barked again, louder this time, and pressed his nose to the crack at the bottom of the door. Thomas sighed, put on his heavy coat, and opened it. The wind rushed in like a living thing, cold enough to sting the lungs. Scout darted out, bounding into the snowdrift, nose low to the ground. The porch light threw a small circle of gold across the whiteness, and in that circle, Thomas could see the dog digging furiously near the old pine at the edge of the yard. "Scout," he called, trudging through snow that reached his knees. The cold bit into his knees, old wounds that had never quite healed. When he reached the pine, Scout had unearthed something from beneath the frost, a small rectangle of dull metal. Thomas bent down, brushing away the clinging snow. His hand trembled when he recognized the letters. Turner, Evan L. A name he knew well. Evan Turner had been Michael's closest friend, the soldier who'd written to Thomas after the funeral, telling him how his son had saved others in his final moments. Evan had died a week later in the same province. The military had sent another letter, another condolence, another folded flag. Thomas stared at the tag glinting in the weak light. "How did you—" he began, but the words caught. Scout was looking up at him, ears pricked, tail still. There was a strange urgency in the dog's eyes, as if he was waiting for Thomas to understand something more than the cold metal in his palm. The snow was falling heavier now, the flakes thick and relentless. Thomas tucked the tag into his pocket and looked toward the forest. A part of him wanted to turn back to the warmth, but another part, the old Marine still buried inside, felt the stirring of duty again. Scout began to move toward the tree line, pausing to glance back. "You want me to follow, huh?" Thomas murmured. For the first time in years, he felt his voice steady. They walked together into the hush of the woods, where the snow muffled every sound but the crunch of boots and paws. The forest smelled of pine and earth, ancient and still. Thomas's breath steamed in the air, mixing with the dog's. His mind drifted to Michael, to Evan, to all the ghosts that still marched behind his eyes. He thought of how silence had become his battlefield, and how this dog, this loyal, stubborn animal, kept dragging him back toward something he didn't want to feel. Hope. When they reached a small clearing, Scout stopped. He pawed at the ground, again, whining softly. Thomas knelt, brushing away the powdery snow. Beneath it, something dark caught the moonlight. A scrap of plastic, part of a sealed envelope. His fingers, numb and clumsy, worked it free. The plastic had cracked with age, but inside was a piece of paper folded small. He tore it open carefully. The ink had faded, but he could still read the first line. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home." The handwriting was unmistakably Michael's. Thomas's heart slammed once against his ribs. The night around him seemed to contract. The forest leaned closer, listening. Scout sat down beside him, pressing his warm flank against the man's leg. Thomas's breath came slow and uneven as he traced the letters with his thumb. The rest of the note was torn away, gone to weather and time. But those words alone were enough to open something long sealed inside him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he saw his son's face as clearly as if he were standing there. The boy's easy grin, the scar on his chin from falling off his bike at 8, the same blue eyes that now belonged to his father. He remembered their last phone call, Michael's voice steady even with gunfire in the distance. "We're good here, Dad. Don't worry." It had been a lie, but a loving one. Thomas folded the letter back into its plastic and tucked it into his coat. The wind had softened, as if the storm itself paused to breathe. Scout leaned into him, head resting against his arm. Thomas whispered, "You knew where to find it, didn't you?" The dog's tail thumped once against the snow. The old man looked up at the clouded moon, his throat tight. For the first time in 5 years, he spoke his son's name aloud, not in grief, but in something close to prayer. "Michael." The forest gave no answer, only the sigh of snow sliding off branches. But Thomas could have sworn he heard, just faintly, a voice carried on the wind. "Follow him, Dad. Scout knows." He stood there for a long while before turning back toward the cabin, Scout walking close by his side, the dog's shoulder brushing his knee with every step. In his pocket, the tag of Evan Turner pressed against the letter from his son, the metal cold, the paper warm. And for the first time in years, Thomas Reed felt the weight of silence ease, just a little. Morning came slow and pale, the kind of winter dawn that never truly brightened, but only shifted shades of gray. The storm had passed, leaving the ground buried beneath a fresh crust of snow. Thomas Reed stood by the window, coffee steaming in his hand, his breath visible in the cold air that still leaked through the seams of the old cabin. The night's discoveries haunted him. The dog tag, the fragment of a letter, his son's handwriting. He had slept little, turning the memories over in his mind like worn stones. Beside the fire, Scout dozed lightly, one ear twitching toward every creak of the wind. His fur was still damp from the night before, clumped in places where snow had melted against the heat. Thomas looked at him with a complicated tenderness. "You knew," he murmured. The dog's eyes flicked open, alert again, as if awaiting orders. By noon, Thomas couldn't sit still. The letter's torn edge gnawed at him. There had to be more. He pulled on his heavy coat, his boots stiff from yesterday's frost, and whistled softly. Scout was on his feet in an instant, tail raised, pacing toward the door. Outside, the world lay quiet and untouched, save for the faint impression of paw prints frozen from the night before. The tracks led east, toward the old military cemetery less than a mile away. Thomas hesitated only a moment before following. The snow squeaked under his weight, the cold cutting deep into his lungs. The cemetery came into view through the haze of flurries, rows of white headstones stretching in neat, mournful lines. The gate stood slightly ajar, its iron hinges groaning in protest when he pushed it wider. Scout trotted ahead, nose low, weaving between the graves until he stopped before one near the back fence. Thomas's heart clenched when he read the name carved into the stone. Michael Reed, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. 1988-2014. Beneath it, the inscription read, "He went where others would not." Snow had gathered thick around the base of the headstone, and Scout began pawing at it, whining softly. "What are you looking for, boy?" Thomas knelt, brushing aside the powder with his gloved hands. Beneath the ice-crusted soil, something pale glimmered, a small sealed plastic pouch, edges brittle with cold. He lifted it gently, heart pounding. Inside was another fragment of paper, folded over and over. He tore the seal with trembling fingers. The handwriting was the same. Michael's. "Dad, if you're reading this, I want you to know something. We all make choices we can't undo, but you taught me that courage isn't about surviving. It's about returning, even when you don't want to. The ink had bled through in places, but the words were clear enough. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat raw. He could hear the echo of his son's voice as if carried by the winter wind. Scout pressed his head against the man's shoulder, a silent anchor. A voice startled him from behind. "Mr. Reed?" He turned, sharply, the motion stiff from cold. A woman stood a few paces away, bundled in a long navy coat, her breath fogging in the air. She looked to be in her 40s, tall and spare, with dark auburn hair tucked into a knit hat and sharp, kind eyes the color of smoke. "I'm Sarah Whitmore," she said, stepping closer. "I work at the Veterans Office downtown. They told me you might still be living out here." Thomas eyed her cautiously. "They told you right. What brings you out in this weather?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes softened with understanding. "I came across some documents while updating digital records, letters that were meant to be returned to families of fallen soldiers. One was addressed to you, but it was marked as delivered. I thought there might have been a mistake." She hesitated, glancing down at the envelope in his hand. "But maybe you already found it." Thomas considered her words carefully. Sarah had the look of someone who had spent too long in offices lit by artificial light. Her skin was pale, her expression patient but weary. Yet there was something resolute about her posture, the way she held her gloved hands clasped before her, as if bracing for rejection. He nodded slowly. "Seems my son left me more than I knew." They stood in silence for a moment. The snow drifted between them like falling ash. Then Sarah said softly, "Your son and mine served together, Mr. Reed. Daniel Whitmore. He was in the same battalion." Thomas's breath caught. "I remember that name. Michael spoke of him. Good kid." She smiled, a small, pained thing. "He was. He didn't make it home either." The quiet that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Two people bound by the same hollow ache recognized each other without need for words. Sarah knelt beside the grave, brushing a gloved hand over the inscription. "You know," she said quietly, "they used to write letters before each mission, just in case. Most never got sent." She looked up at him. "Sometimes the dogs remembered where the soldiers hid them. They trained them to. Muscle memory, I guess." Thomas stared at Scout, the pieces beginning to align. "You think he's remembering?" Sarah nodded. "Maybe he's trying to finish what your son started." The thought settled into him like a spark in cold ashes. He folded the paper again, sliding it into his pocket. "Then I suppose we'd better keep following him." Sarah stood, brushing snow from her coat. "If you'll let me, I'd like to help. I know some of the old search routes near the training range outside town." Thomas hesitated. For years he had refused company. Neighbors, church friends, anyone who tried to bridge the silence. But something in Sarah's voice, the steadiness that comes from shared loss, loosened his instinct to shut the door. "All right," he said at last. "But you'd better bring a stronger coat next time." She laughed softly, the sound cutting through the still air. "Deal." When she left, Thomas lingered by the grave. The wind had shifted, and he could smell the faint trace of the sea beyond the hills. He crouched down beside Scout. "Looks like we've got help now," he said. The dog wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, before turning his gaze toward the tree line, as if already plotting the next path. As they walked home, the clouds broke for a moment, revealing a sliver of blue sky. The light fell across the snow, catching the tiny ice crystals so they glittered like stars scattered across the ground. For the first time in half a decade, Thomas didn't feel the full weight of winter pressing against his chest. There was still more to uncover, more of Michael's words buried somewhere out there. But he was no longer searching alone. Back at the cabin, he hung his coat and placed the second letter fragment beside the first on the small wooden table. The two pieces fit together along one jagged edge, the ink lines nearly touching. He stared at them until the fire's reflection danced over the paper. Scout lay down at his feet, sighing deeply. Thomas reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. "We're getting closer," he whispered. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, endless. And in its hush, the house no longer felt empty. The next morning dawned sharp and blue, sunlight glinting on the frozen world like shards of glass. Thomas Reed awoke to the creak of old wood and the faint smell of coffee burning in the pot. He had slept little. The second fragment of his son's letter lay on the table beside him, as though watching him through the night. Scout sat by the door, alert, tail motionless, his gaze fixed on the woods beyond the window. Thomas had seen that look before. Purpose, memory, something more primal than words. He dressed in silence, pulling on his worn field jacket, the one still bearing the faded patch of his old unit. Scout wagged his tail once as Thomas clipped the leash, though the leash was mostly ceremonial. Scout never ran far. The two stepped out into the brittle cold. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws. The air was sharp enough to sting the skin, the kind of cold that carved silence into everything it touched. A few hours later, Sarah Whitmore arrived, driving an old green Jeep that looked nearly as tired as its owner. The vehicle coughed smoke as it rolled to a stop beside Thomas's cabin. Sarah stepped out, bundled in a thicker coat this time, her hair tucked under a wool hat, her cheeks pink from the wind. "You weren't kidding about the cold," she said, smiling faintly as she rubbed her gloved hands. Thomas nodded. "You came back." "I said I would," she replied simply. Her tone was calm, but her eyes carried the same quiet fire as yesterday, a mix of grief and determination. "I brought maps from the old training sites. Daniel's unit used to run drills north of here. If Michael was with them, that might be where these letters were buried." They spread the maps over the hood of the Jeep. Thomas traced a calloused finger along the faded grid lines, stopping near a frozen river marked Old Quarry Creek. "Michael mentioned that name once," he murmured. "Said they camped there before their last mission." He folded the map carefully. "We'll start there." Sarah nodded and glanced at Scout, who was circling near the edge of the forest, sniffing the wind. "Looks like he's ready," she said. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He always is. The trail to the creek was narrow and half buried in snow. Pines loomed above them, their branches heavy with ice. Scout moved ahead, weaving through drifts, occasionally pausing to glance back as if to make sure they followed. Sarah trudged beside Thomas, her breath fogging the air. After a while, she broke the silence. "How long were you in the Marines?" 21 years, he answered. "Enlisted at 19, fought 2 wars, came home from both." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But this one, the one after Michael, it's the longest one yet." She nodded quietly. "Grief's a kind of war too, just slower." They walked on. The wind picked up, tugging at their coats. When they reached the creek, it was frozen solid, a long white scar, cutting through the woods. Scout paced near the bank, nose pressed to the ground. Suddenly he barked once, sharp and clear, and began pawing at the snow. Thomas knelt beside him, brushing away the frost until his hand struck something hard. A rusted tin box, half buried in ice. His heart thudded. Together he and Sarah pried it loose. The lid creaked open to reveal another folded paper, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was Michael's handwriting again, the ink smudged but legible. "Dad, if you ever find this, don't stop. There's more I need you to see. I left them for you and for Scout. He'll remember. Tell him I said good boy." The letter went on, describing a night raid that had gone wrong, the noise, the confusion, and the moment when Michael realized he would not make it back. "I wasn't scared," the note read, "because I knew you'd understand. You always said fear means you're still alive." Thomas read the words aloud in a low voice, his throat tight. Sarah listened in silence, her gloved hands pressed together, the wind tangling loose strands of hair around her face. "He wrote it to you," she said softly. "Not to the world, not to command, just to you." Thomas folded the letter, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers brushed against the earlier fragments. "He knew I'd need something to follow," he said. "Something to keep me walking." Scout barked again, this time facing downstream. The sound echoed off the trees. Sarah frowned. "He wants us to go that way." Thomas looked ahead, toward where the river curved between the cliffs. "That's the quarry," he said. "It's where the old training camp used to be." The wind was stronger there, sweeping snow into whirling ghosts. Scout led them across the frozen creek, paws sure and steady. Halfway through, the ice groaned under their weight. Sarah froze. "Is it safe?" "Mostly," Thomas replied, his tone grim but calm. "Keep moving." They made it across just as a crack split the ice behind them. Thomas exhaled. Scout shook snow from his coat, unbothered. At the far bank, they found remnants of a camp. Torn canvas, rusted cans, the skeleton of a fire pit long extinguished. Scout sniffed near the ashes, then suddenly sat down, pawing at the dirt. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Thomas crouched beside the dog. Under the frozen layer was another object, this time not metal, but something soft, wrapped in cloth. He peeled the layers back to reveal a military journal, small and leather-bound, its corners burned. The first page bore Michael's name. Thomas opened it carefully. The handwriting shifted from steady to rushed, the ink blotted in places. Michael had recorded details of his missions, but between the tactical notes, personal lines appeared. "Sometimes I wonder if Dad ever forgave himself for the wars he fought. I joined to understand him. Maybe this is how I'll find peace too." Thomas's vision blurred. The journal trembled in his hands. Sarah placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You're finding him again," she said quietly, piece by piece. They sat there for a long time, surrounded by the sound of melting ice and wind. When Thomas finally stood, the journal pressed to his chest. He looked at Sarah and managed a faint, hoarse smile. "He didn't want to be found by the world," he said. "Just by me." As they turned back toward home, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, soft and slow, erasing their footprints as they went. Scout walked ahead, tail high, leading them once more through the silence. In the fading light, Thomas thought he saw movement among the trees, a flicker of khaki, a young man's silhouette standing proud before vanishing into the white. He didn't call out. Some things were meant to stay between a father, a son, and the wind. By dusk, The sky above Portland had turned the color of gunmetal. The wind carried a low, mournful hum as it swept through the pines outside Thomas Reed's cabin. He stood by the window, the journal of his late son clutched in both hands, the paper fragile from time and frost. Each page had opened a door to memories long sealed. Now only one thing remained unsolved. Michael's final location, the place hinted at but never revealed in the writings. Scout, the aging German shepherd, lay beside the hearth, his amber eyes half-lidded yet alert, his body tense as if sensing a change in the air. Thomas had grown thinner over the past few days, his shoulders bowed but still strong. The sleepless nights and the sharp cold had carved deeper lines across his face, yet there was a quiet vitality in his movements now, a purpose that dulled his grief. When Sarah Whitmore knocked softly at the door, he already knew it was her. Sarah entered with a gust of icy wind. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold, and strands of her dark auburn hair escaped from beneath her hood. She held a thermos of coffee and a small metal case. "It's coming," she said. "The news said a nor'easter's headed this way. We should get what we need before we're snowed in." Thomas poured a cup from her thermos, his fingers steady despite the tremor of age. "You think the next clue's still out there?" Sarah nodded, setting the case on the table. Inside were a compass, a flashlight, and laminated maps now marked in red pen. Based on the coordinates from Michael's journal, there's an old communications tower east of the quarry. It was abandoned years ago, but if he buried anything, that's where it'd be. Thomas studied the map silently. The tower stood deep in the forest, across uneven terrain where few people dared to hike in winter. "You don't have to come," he said. "I know," Sarah replied, her tone firm but gentle. "But Daniel would have wanted me to." Her voice faltered slightly at her son's name, but she steadied herself quickly. She was not a fragile woman. Loss had hardened her into someone both resilient and deeply kind. Thomas saw the same endurance in her that he once admired in his soldiers, the courage to stand in the storm because retreat was no longer possible. They left just after dawn. The storm had already begun whispering through the trees, small flurries swirling like ghosts. Scout led them through knee-deep snow, stopping occasionally to sniff the air and change direction. The old dog moved with surprising determination, his gray muzzle dusted white with frost. Hours passed. The forest thickened, the world narrowing to the crunch of boots and the howl of the wind. Thomas's breath came in clouds, each one torn away by the cold. Sarah walked close behind, her scarf pulled high across her face, her gloved hand resting on the strap of her pack. She glanced at Thomas occasionally, worried for the man's endurance, but his stride never faltered. The Marine in him, buried beneath years of silence, had returned. By mid-afternoon, they reached a clearing where the skeletal frame of the old radio tower rose from the snow like a monument to forgotten wars. The metal groaned in the wind, its cables singing faintly. Scout began pacing the base, nose pressed to the ground. Thomas and Sarah watched in silence until the dog stopped, pawing furiously at a spot near a collapsed generator box. Thomas knelt and began digging with his bare hands, ignoring Sarah's protest. His gloves were soaked through, the cold biting his skin raw, but he didn't stop. Something metallic clinked beneath the ice. Together, they cleared the snow until a small lockbox appeared, its lid rusted shut. Sarah handed him her knife. "Here." Thomas pried the latch until it snapped open with a sharp crack. Inside was a single sealed envelope and a silver pendant, Michael's identification tag, the edges worn smooth. The letter was short, written in a steady but fading hand. If you've come this far, then Scout did his job. I left everything I couldn't say in the journal. But there's one thing I need you to believe. You did your best, Dad. You always did. The war wasn't your fault, and neither was mine. Don't keep living in it. Come home. Thomas's breath shuddered. For a moment, he couldn't see the words. The tears froze almost as soon as they fell. Sarah rested a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. Scout nudged closer, pressing his head into Thomas's leg. A crack split the silence. A sound like ice fracturing. The ground beneath them trembled. "Thomas!" Sarah shouted. Snow began sliding from the tower, an avalanche of white and debris. Scout barked furiously as Thomas stumbled backward, clutching the letter to his chest. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the tree line just as the tower groaned and one of its beams crashed down, spraying snow and ice. They collapsed behind a boulder, gasping. The letter was still in Thomas's hand, safe. The storm roared to life around them now, wind screaming, snow blinding. Scout stood guard before them, his fur whipping in the gale. Thomas turned to Sarah, his voice hoarse but alive with awe. "He led us right here. He wanted me to find this now." Sarah smiled through the cold. "Then maybe this storm isn't the end. Maybe it's the way home." When they finally returned to the cabin that night, soaked and frozen, the storm raged on outside, hammering the roof. Thomas lit the fire, its glow painting the walls gold. He laid the letter beside the others and placed the pendant atop them. Scout curled beside the hearth, tail thumping once, as if to signal the mission was complete. Sarah sat quietly near the window, watching the snow bury the world in silence. Thomas joined her, and for the first time in years, he spoke without restraint. "You know, he used to say the snow made the world clean again. Maybe he was right." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then tomorrow, we'll start fresh." Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind softening into a whisper. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Thomas reached down, resting his hand on Scout's head, and closed his eyes. The old soldier finally exhaled, not as a man mourning his son, but as a father who had finally come home. Morning crept into the cabin like a hesitant guest, pale light slipping through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving the land cloaked in white silence. Thomas Reed stirred in his armchair, the fire long since burned to embers. Scout slept beside him, his fur glinting faintly in the soft dawn, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't wake to the pounding echoes of artillery or the cries of ghosts from his past. He woke to peace, a strange, foreign quiet that felt both fragile and sacred. Sarah Whitmore had stayed the night, at Thomas's insistence. She was seated near the table now, flipping through Michael's journal by the warm light of a single oil lamp. Her auburn hair, still damp from melted snow, fell loosely over her shoulders. The exhaustion of the journey had softened her sharp features, revealing a quiet kindness that seemed to reach into every corner of the cabin. When she looked up and met Thomas's eyes, she smiled faintly. "He wrote beautifully," she said, "like he wanted to be understood, not remembered." Thomas nodded slowly. His face looked older in the morning light, the deep lines of age and grief etched like scars. But there was a calm strength in him now. He stood, moving stiffly, and poured 2 mugs of coffee. "Michael never talked much," he said, setting one in front of her. "He was his mother's son. patient, steady. I was always the storm. Sarah closed the journal gently. You're the reason he learned to fight for what mattered, she said. And you're the reason he still speaks, through every word he left behind. Outside, Scout barked once, short and sharp. Thomas stepped to the window and saw a figure trudging up the snowy path toward the cabin. A man in a dark parka, carrying something under his arm. Thomas's instincts flickered awake. Stay here, he murmured. He opened the door, the cold air biting his face as the stranger came into view. The man stopped a few paces away and lifted a hand in greeting. He was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and a weathered face marked by fine lines at the eyes. His name tag read, Captain Alan Brooks, though the military stiffness in his bearing suggested Thomas didn't need to ask. You must be Sergeant Reed, the man said. His voice was low, gravelly, but not unkind. I served with your boy. Thomas's jaw tensed. You knew Michael? Brooks nodded, stepping forward. He was one of mine. I was stationed with him in Fallujah before his last deployment. I never got to say goodbye. He removed his gloves and held out the object he carried, an old, leather-bound notebook wrapped in canvas. This belonged to him. We found it with our unit's effects, but it got lost in storage during a base closure. I only came across it again last month. Thomas took the notebook with trembling hands. It was heavier than it looked, water-stained, the cover marked with Michael's initials. You brought this all the way here? Brooks's expression softened. Some debts don't expire, Sergeant. Sarah appeared at the doorway, her scarf pulled close. She greeted the newcomer politely, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. You must be Sarah, Brooks said. Michael mentioned a friend's mother who wrote letters to every man in the unit. Said it helped keep the noise out of their heads. Her eyes glistened. That was me, she said softly. They went inside. The three sat near the fire as Thomas opened the notebook. Inside were sketches, rough pencil drawings of mountains, rivers, and faces half-remembered. Between them were notes, one dated a few weeks before Michael's death. Dad, I know you still blame yourself for everything you couldn't save. But the truth is, you saved me every day I knew you. If you ever read this, take Scout and go to the place where the sun first found us. You'll know. Thomas frowned. The place where the sun first found us? Brooks leaned forward. He meant Silver Ridge. We trained there before the final mission. There's a ridge where they used to watch the sunrise together. Without speaking, Thomas stood, buttoning his coat. Sarah rose too, eyes questioning. Now? She asked. Now, he said, before the light fades. The three of them hiked through the quiet forest, Scout leading the way. The snow glistened in the afternoon sun, the air still and pure. When they reached the ridge, Thomas stopped short. Before them stretched the valley below, an ocean of white and gold. It was the same view his son must have watched years ago, perhaps dreaming of home. He took the pendant from his pocket, the one they had found at the tower, and hung it from a low branch of a pine tree. The metal caught the sunlight, flashing once like a star. Sarah stood beside him, silent. Brooks saluted quietly, then stepped back. Thomas knelt in the snow and whispered, You made it home, son. We both did. Scout pressed close to his side, his tail brushing against Thomas's coat. They stayed until the sun dipped behind the ridge. No one spoke. When they turned back toward the forest, the light caught their shadows and stretched them long. 3 figures and 1 loyal dog, walking toward the life that waited beyond grief. That evening, back at the cabin, Thomas lit the fire once more. He placed the final notebook beside the letters and the journal, arranging them carefully. Sarah brewed tea while Brooks stared into the flames, lost in thought. Scout lay down near the hearth, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Thomas looked around at the faces in the room. One friend, one soldier, one creature who had never stopped believing, and felt something stir inside him, quiet and whole. He reached down, resting his hand on Scout's back. "Good watch, buddy," he whispered. "You can stand down now." The dog let out a slow, contented sigh. Outside, the night settled soft over Portland, the wind carrying the faintest echo of laughter, like a boy calling his father home through the snow. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. They come quietly, in the shape of a dog who refuses to give up, a letter buried beneath the snow, or a sunrise that still finds its way through the clouds. Thomas once believed that God had gone silent after war took his son. But standing on that frozen ridge, he learned the truth. God had never stopped speaking. He had been there all along, in every paw print Scout left behind, in every letter that found its way home, in every act of love that refuses to die. Maybe that's what faith really is. Not a promise that pain will disappear, but a whisper reminding us that we're not walking through it alone. So tonight, if you're watching this, and your heart carries a weight too heavy to name, pause, breathe, and know your story isn't over yet. There is still light waiting for you just beyond the next dawn. If this story touched your soul, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that love never dies. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and join us in spreading these stories of hope and faith. And may God bless you, your family, and every loyal heart, both the two-legged and the four-legged ones, who keep watch beside us in this life and the next.